Hello everyone, thank you for joining my session today. My name is Dmitry Vinnik and I'm a developer advocate on the Facebook open source team. Today I'll talk about measuring open source project health and how to improve it. So let's go. As I said, we're going to discuss measuring open source project health and how to improve it, or I also call this presentation the 10,000 steps of open source project health. So first of all, I'd like to try to establish my credibility and talk about what I do. I'm currently, as I mentioned, open source developer advocate at Facebook, and we have opensource.fb.com where you can find lots of content from our team. You can find our portfolio of open source projects, our blog, our YouTube channel, our podcast, many different things. But ultimately, our goal is to empower diverse communities through open source technology. I myself focus on mobile pillar at the moment, on projects for Android and iOS native and also hybrid mobile projects like React Native, for instance. Litho that helps you to build UI declaratively for Android. Fresco, a project to help manage images for Android, and also Flipper that allows people to freely debug mobile applications. And it's just 4 out of many other projects that are part of our portfolio for mobile. But more importantly for today is that I am passionate about open source, and that's why I'll be talking about it today. And it's not just about Facebook open source, it's more broadly covering open source as a whole. While some context is important, this presentation might not fit projects that are only led by 1 or 2 people, while I'm still having expectations of a certain scale, like a team behind a project or a company, and that's what I will be giving some insight into from my experience. So first, I'd like to quickly talk about what is open source. And it's a process of making technology available for others to use and improve. And the last 2 words are the most important ones, use and improve, meaning that we are looking for 2 main personas at least. Our users of open source, and contributors, those who help us improve the project, those who help contribute back to the project. And that's very important to keep in mind. And that's what defines open source. But why people contribute to the open source? Why companies contribute to open source? First, it's the community. People are looking for that community behind the project because it's really what at the very core of open source. Leadership. If you are creating an open source project and you are leading it, or you are participating as one of the core contributors to the project, you become you have an important role in that industry, in that area, whether it's AI, ML, mobile, web. And that's why, again, corporations often contribute to open source. Productivity. You have people from different backgrounds, extremely diverse communities in some cases, that help improve your project. You might not think about some accessibility issues, for instance, because your team hasn't had experience with that. And people in open source will be able to do that for you. So it's one of just examples of how productive you can get with open source. But also important thing to keep in mind is branding. It can help you with recruitment. It can help with just elevate your brand as a company. There are some enterprise organizations that entirely built on open source, and that's where branding come into play. And if you'd like to see more and hear more about this topic of why people contribute to open source and what open source is, you can watch this Explain Like I'm 5 video, part of our ELI 5 series on Facebook open source YouTube channel, where we covered open source as a topic. So how do people contribute to open source? Some of the things, and I'll talk about that in length, is through source code, actually making changes to the code base. Some are through documentation, and it's very important. Every contribution matters, whether it's changing the piece of code or changing something in documentation. And that's what it's important for people to contribute, whether they know how to code or not. Translations. Even if you don't see how you can improve the project right now, maybe you have some second language that you know that you can help translate documentation. And also testing. People often focus on development and forget about testing, but testing is what drives software development lifecycle. That's where it helps us to maintain software, and that's why it's very important for open source. And you can contribute there to the open source project as well. And if you'd like to see more about contributing for the first time, you can watch another video on our YouTube channel on contributing to open source for the first time by Cami Williams. But in particular for this presentation, what are we trying to achieve? What is our goal? So our goals is defining gaps in the open source project health, providing some guidelines. I don't believe in dogmatism. I don't believe on following things that just particular step-by-step instructions, especially for open source. Every project is different. So I'm only going to give you some guidelines that you can follow. And more importantly, is throughout this whole presentation, the one thing that will be clear is that communication is the key on every step. So, Facebook open source. Based on the experience that I've had, is there some metrics that you can define open source health for everything, for every project out there? And the short answer is no. The long answer is, as every consultant would say, it depends. There is some metrics, obviously, that you can use. There are potential health metrics like repo numbers, whether it's stars, watchers, forks on the GitHub or GitLab repository. It's your forums like Reddit, Stack Overflow, or other Q&A chats that you can collect sentiment analysis or just seeing how many questions people ask and how interactive people are. Twitter and YouTube or other, again, areas where people can talk to each other, whether it's Slack or Discord. And there is also something called Orbit model. Orbit is basically the model behind this great website, I believe, Orbit, that helps people to try to define some metrics and grow the community through quite prescriptive methodologies. That I invite you to give a try, but I'm not going to go dive deeper into that here. So instead of looking at numbers and this particular metrics, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'll talk about more conceptual approach, what things to look for, what kind of guidelines I can give you to hopefully find what works for you and improve your project. So that's why I'm covering guidelines today. And it's not, as I said before, it's not about Facebook, but I'm still thinking about large scale. So in general, there are 5 types of open source work you can think of. And the types of work that we'll discuss are planning, branding, documentation work, and code-based work, source code work. So let's go one by one. Let's look at planning first. Why do we want to open source project in the first place? Open sourcing project for the sake of open sourcing is not a reasoning. You have to know exactly why you're open sourcing something and how you're going to wind it down eventually. Are you going to have a world domination, or are you going to sunset or archive it down the line? Think of that. Maybe you're going to move it to a foundation or do something with it. You have to keep that in mind at the very first stage of open sourcing. Even before you even open source, at the time of launch, you have to have a plan behind your actions. Possible goals that one can have and should kind of acknowledge is recruiting. You're trying to recruit people to your organization or maybe to your project through that open source work that you're sharing. Contributions. You're actually looking for people to contribute and improve your project that you are going to use internally, maybe, or as an enterprise supporter of the project. Branding. Again, that's very important, as maybe you're trying to position yourself as an organization, open source organization as well. And adoption. You're actually trying to dominate the market or maybe become a big player in the market. And that's where, another UI framework might come into play, and it would be a good example. Always think long term. But the important thing overall is that you have to have your team's commitment. Whoever is behind the project, at least especially initially, you need to know that they are doing it they have a passion for it. They have a commitment to support it. They have on call if there are some GitHub issues that pop up or PRs. How fast will you review them? Think of it in the enterprise terms, like you have a SLA. Basically, you have expectation to reply to folks online within a week, maybe a month, maybe a year even, but still have that expectation set with your team ahead of time. When it comes to branding basically, is not just about marketing. We're not thinking marketing as it's usually said. Marketing often is viewed negatively. Instead, it's really about showing commitment from your project. When you actually think about branding a bit more. Branding, you can think of naming. You actually thought of a name. You did some research. You Googled that when you, let's say, have some common name. Pandora, for example, and you try to Google for it, and you see Pandora is a jewelry store or common brand that people have, and search engine optimization will downgrade your project way down the line. So you have to think about proper name, especially when it comes to packaging as well, like npms or some Python packages. Logo, even if you're not trying to pay some expensive designer to create a logo for you, something easily drawn by you or your team, actually exciting, maybe get community involved and draw a logo for your project. Have a narrative. How are you going to position your project? What is it for? What problem it's solving? Document it in a README. That really shows your commitment. Branding is one of the ways we are seeing the commitment from the project. And social media. Maybe you don't have to actually have a Twitter account or Facebook account, but maybe reserve a name for you, so your project can be shared with the community where your community resides. Maybe it's an email list, because your community primarily uses emails. So think of that too. For documentation work, documentation is one of the cornerstones of open source. If you look at the top projects, just worldwide, they all have amazing documentation. People spend hours and hours, days and months, years on making sure it's as good as possible, as accessible as possible, as welcoming as possible. So it's really what often makes or break the project. Documentation, it's great for contributions, especially first-time contributions. It makes it searchable. People can actually find it on Google or elsewhere, or even on a website. That's where a website is quite handy. And again, creating the website helps people to find your project, not just on a README. README and just markdown files on your repository, it's limiting. But the website with a search bar and some quick guidance, frequently asked questions, really sets project apart from many others out there. Consider using Alex.js. Alex.js finds unwelcoming words that you might be using, biased language, things of that sort that really helps. This Alex.js linter helps you to find and exclude from your documentation. So do things of that sort. Make it welcome, make your project welcoming to other more diverse backgrounds. The last part that open source work that I want to cover is code base. The code base, the important things to mention are code of conduct. You want to make sure that your community has code of conduct established that kind of guides how the community behaves, how you deal with bad actors, how you navigate some conflicts, or what you establish as the environment in your project. And there are lots of great examples of where to grab the code of conduct from. README is what people first see on GitHub or GitLab, so make sure that one is well defined. You explain what you're looking for, why it's there. So it's very important to have proper README for your project. Have contributors guide. If you are looking for contributions, you should have a contributors guide, so they know how to get started, how to build your project on their local machine, how to have it in development mode, how to make the pull requests, have a pull request form for them, a template, if you're using GitHub, for example. And again, PRs and issues, it has to be part of the contributors guide, but as I mentioned, have a template. With GitHub, you have a great way to establish what you're looking for when someone files a pull request or an issue. You don't want to have a back and forth with whoever filed one of these items on if it's a failure of a test, what's your reproduction steps? What did you expect to happen? What actually happened? Make sure you define that, and because if there is some vagueness, it usually will be filled with the confusion or just back and forth. You want to avoid back and forth. Maintenance cost of open source is actually quite high, and that's where problems usually arise, and it makes your project health worse. So keep that in mind. So we talked about planning, branding, docs, and code base, quite a few things. But last but not least thing I want to mention is the community work. It's a thing of its own, and it's important on every level of open source work, and that's why I kind of define it as a separate thing. It's team driven. It really has to come from your overall team. Often it's focused on content, so make sure that the community knows your team. They know where they contribute, how to learn your projects, things like tutorials, videos, podcasts. It again goes back to branding even, but make room for others to produce that content. That's always exciting to see in some space, especially web space, how many tutorials people outside of the company or a team that originally created the project created. That again, the content driven by the community is always best. Have a community space, place for people to congregate, to connect with each other, ask questions. Have a Slack channel, Discord channel, place for people to go and see the team that behind the project. Ask a question, and if you actually see more questions popping up in those spaces, move them to frequently asked section on your website, on your documentation. So everything is interconnected with your community, because open source is all about the community. And communication is the key. If you don't tell your project contributors or users what to expect, they might abandon you. They might abandon the project. And it's the lack of the communication that usually leads to disaster. So I've talked about many things here. Call for action that I would like to leave you with. Focus on communication. It's extremely important to talk to your audience, know exactly what they're expecting. Maybe share your roadmap. Share exactly that you're not expecting contributions or you're looking for contributions. What stage your project is in. Is it production ready or is it still in beta, alpha, whatever it might be? Make sure you clear that up with the community that you are trying to reach. But know your community. That's maybe you are in a space that well known, or it's a brand new space like blockchain or NFT, whatever it might be. Really know who you're working with and who you're building for, and that's where you target them with community space. Maybe again they're using email lists only, or they only using Slack or Discord, whatever they might be using. So know where your community is at. And still, even though I said metrics and numbers, it's hard to define. Collect that metrics. Down the line, you'll see some patterns that will hopefully align with your project, with your community, and you can actually define metrics and success criteria for you and your team. So thank you, everybody. My name is Dmitry Vinnik. Please reach me on my Twitter, blog, LinkedIn, or email me directly if you have any questions, and I'm excited to you working on open source and thinking of how to improve it. So thank you so much for your time.